Grew up in a house where I was always the odd one out. My stepmother, Linda, would eye me across the dinner table and say, just loud enough for my father to hear, "Isn't it odd? She doesn't look a bit like you, Mark." My younger half-sister, Julia, would snicker and whisper to her friends, "She's probably not even his real daughter." For years, I believed them. I believed I was the mistake, the outsider, the one who didn't belong. So when my father passed away and Julia, with a voice full of fake sympathy, demanded a DNA test at the will reading, I wasn't shocked. What did surprise me was what happened next. The lawyer, Mr. Patel, opened the results in a room full of relatives who barely remembered my name. Julia was grinning, certain she'd finally be rid of me. But when Mr. Patel looked up, he didn't look at me, he looked straight at Julia and asked a question that made her face go white as a sheet. In that moment, everything I thought I knew about my family unraveled. My name is Rachel Evans. I'm 36, a CFO at a consulting firm in Chicago. On paper, I have everything: an impressive job, a nice apartment, respect from my peers. But I've never had what I wanted most: a family that truly wanted me. I found out about my father's death through a cold, formal email from his attorney. No phone call, no message from family, just a 3-paragraph note. Mark Evans had passed, and my presence was required at the will reading. It had been 18 years since I'd spoken to anyone in that house. 18 years since I left at 17. Convinced no one would notice I was gone, driving up the long driveway in a rental car, I saw Linda at the upstairs window, watching me arrive. Her face wasn't sad, it was anxious, almost fearful. That look brought back memories I'd tried to bury. Linda, examining family photos, pointing out how I looked nothing like my father, and my father's silence in response. At 15, I wrote my father letters from summer camp, desperate for a connection. He never replied. I told myself he was busy, but deep down, I believed he just didn't care. At 17, I caught him crying over a photo of my late mother. But when he saw me, he shut down completely. Now, standing in the foyer of my childhood home, those memories pressed on me like stones. The house was full of relatives I barely recognized, their conversations stopping whenever I walked by. I heard the whispers. "She's just here for the money." Never visited once. Linda clung to Julia, the two of them whispering constantly. Julia had grown into a polished, confident woman, everything I apparently wasn't. When she finally spoke, her voice was full of authority. "Before we read Dad's will, I think Rachel should take a DNA test to prove she's actually his daughter." The room murmured in agreement. I saw Linda nod, too eagerly. Something about this felt rehearsed, like a trap. So I did the only thing that made sense. "I'll take the test," I said. "But the will mentions biological children. Shouldn't everyone claiming inheritance be tested?" Julia laughed. "Fine by me. I have nothing to hide." But for a split second, I saw fear flicker across Linda's face. And across the room, my grandmother, my mother's mother, whom Linda had pushed out of our lives, caught my eye and gave me a small, knowing nod. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. I stayed in a guest room that felt more like a holding cell, waiting for the DNA results. Part of me wanted to run, but something kept me there. Maybe it was my grandmother's nod. Maybe it was the fear I'd seen in Linda's eyes. Or maybe, after 18 years, I was finally ready to stand my ground. But the secrets in that house ran deeper than I ever imagined. And soon, I'd discover that the person pointing fingers had the most to hide. My father's funeral was held on a rainy Tuesday. Julia had taken charge of every detail, making sure I knew my place. When I arrived at the church, I was directed to a seat in the back row, behind distant cousins I barely remembered. The program listed the Evans family in elegant script, but my name was at the very bottom, under other relatives. Not daughter, not family, just other. Linda delivered the eulogy, painting a picture of a perfect family, a loving marriage, a devoted daughter, Julia. She never mentioned me. It was as if I'd never existed, as if the first years of my father's life as a parent, the years with my mother and me, had been erased. After the service, as people moved to the reception, Someone pressed a folded note into my hand. It was Rosa, the housekeeper who'd always been kind to me. The note read, Dad's study, third floor. He wanted you to see it. I have the key. I found Rosa in the kitchen later. She explained that my father had kept the study locked for years, telling Linda it was for confidential work. After his stroke, Linda controlled everything who could visit, what calls he took, even his mail. Rosa handed me a small brass key. Mr. Patel gave this to me for you. He said you should see what's inside. Alone, the third floor had always been off limits. My heart pounded as I climbed the stairs and unlocked the door. Inside, I found a room that was more shrine than study. Every wall was covered with photos of me, professional shots, candid moments, newspaper clippings about my career. He'd tracked my entire adult life without me knowing. On the desk was a thick folder. The first document was a DNA test from 12 years ago. I read it 3 times before it sank in. Julia Evans had no biological relationship to Mark Evans. My sister wasn't my father's daughter. There were medical records from when Julia needed a bone marrow transplant. A note from the doctor explained that my father had volunteered, but wasn't a genetic match. That's how he'd discovered the truth. There were trust fund documents showing he'd been sending me money for years through Mr. Patel. I'd thought it was a grant for women entrepreneurs. It wasn't. It was my father, watching over me from afar. There were divorce papers. Finalized 5 years ago. My father had divorced Linda, but let her and Julia stay for Julia's sake. And in a separate envelope, I found something that made my throat close up. Dozens of letters, still sealed, addressed to my father in my teenage handwriting. The letters I'd sent from camp, the ones I thought he'd ignored. Someone had hidden them from him. In the center of the desk was a letter in my father's shaky handwriting, dated 2 months before his death. It began, My dearest Rachel, I have failed you in ways I can never explain. He explained how Linda had lied about Julia's paternity, how he'd discovered the truth, how his stroke had left him helpless, and how he'd watched over me from a distance, sending money, collecting every piece of my life he could find. The will, he wrote, was his last act to make things right. The letter ended mid-sentence. He'd died before he could finish. I was still holding the letter, tears streaming down my face, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I grabbed the most important documents, just as the door swung open. Julia stood there, her face pale, her eyes darting from my face to the papers in my hands. Julia's world was about to shatter, and so was everything I thought I knew about my own. Julia's eyes were wide with fear as she stared at the documents in my hands. What is that? She whispered. For the first time in 18 years, I saw real panic in her eyes. I didn't answer. I just walked past her, clutching the folder, and locked myself in my room. The next 3 days passed in tense silence. Julia avoided me. Linda watched me with barely concealed panic, trying to guess how much I knew. I waited, saying nothing, holding my cards close until the will reading. The will reading was held at Mr. Patel's office. The room was small and formal, with leather chairs arranged in a semicircle. Linda arrived first, dressed in black, still playing the grieving widow. Julia sat beside her, but I noticed she'd moved her chair slightly away from her mother. My grandmother sat quietly in the back. Mr. Patel began by explaining the will's terms. Mr. Evans added a special clause 2 years ago. His estate is to be distributed only to his biological children. All claimants must consent to DNA verification. Anyone who refuses forfeits their claim. DNA samples for comparison have been preserved. Linda's confident mask slipped for a moment. She hadn't expected this. She'd assumed that with my father gone, there'd be no way to verify anything. But my father had anticipated her. Mr. Patel continued. Both Rachel and Julia consented to testing, and Mr. Evans provided a sample before his passing. We now have the results. He opened a sealed envelope. The room went silent. Rachel Evans. 99.9% biological match to Mark Evans. I exhaled. Linda let out a shaky breath, still hoping things would go her way. Mr. Patel continued. Julia Evans. Zero biological relationship to Mark Evans. No genetic markers in common. The room erupted. Julia jumped up, shouting, That's impossible. There's been a mistake. She turned to Linda, desperate. Mom, tell them they're wrong. But Linda sat frozen, her mind racing. Then she stood, her voice sharp. This is a conspiracy. Mr. Patel has always favored Rachel. He must have tampered with the results. I'd been waiting for this. I opened the folder and held up the DNA test from my father's study. Explain this, I said. This test is from 12 years ago. Dad already knew. He found out when Julia needed a bone marrow transplant. The doctors told him he wasn't a match. That's when he ordered this test. Linda snapped. That proves nothing. He accepted Julia as his daughter anyway. He loved her. Legally, she's still entitled. Mr. Patel cut her off. Mrs. Evans, or rather, Miss Linda Shaw, since your divorce was finalized 5 years ago, you have no legal standing here. Julia's claim depends entirely on biological relationship. Per the will, Linda turned to Julia, pleading. Don't you see what they're doing? They're trying to steal your inheritance. We can fight this. But Julia's voice cut through her mother's protests. You knew I wasn't his daughter. You always knew. Linda's mask cracked. Julia, I was protecting you. Everything I did was for you. Julia's voice trembled with rage and pain. You spent my whole life telling me Rachel was the outsider. You made me treat her like garbage. And the whole time, it was me who didn't belong. She turned to me, tears in her eyes. Did you know before today? I held up the file. I found out 2 days ago. Dad knew for 12 years. He never told anyone but Mr. Patel. He loved you, Julia. That's why he stayed silent. Mr. Patel cleared his throat. Mr. Evans left a letter to be read now. He read my father's words aloud, explaining everything: Linda's deception, his discovery, his helplessness after the stroke, and his final attempt to make things right. When the letter ended, the room was silent. Linda stood alone, abandoned. Julia slumped in her chair, hollow and broken. But the fallout from the truth was just beginning, and the consequences would change all our lives forever. The weeks after the will reading were a blur of legal meetings and paperwork. Mr. Patel walked me through the details of Linda's downfall. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed decades ago left her with nothing after the divorce. She'd agreed to those terms, never imagining she'd need to worry. But my father had discovered something else. Linda had been siphoning money from household accounts for years, hiding funds in secret accounts. When my father found out, it nullified any claim she might have had to marital assets. The divorce had been finalized quietly, to spare Julia public humiliation. Linda came to collect her things one afternoon. She looked smaller, diminished. The woman who'd controlled the house for decades was gone, replaced by someone desperate. She tried one last time to manipulate me. Rachel, please. I made mistakes, but I was just trying to protect my daughter. Surely you can understand. I cut her off. You spent years destroying my relationship with my father. You hid my letters, poisoned Julia against me, isolated my father after his stroke. You let me believe I was unwanted my whole life. The only reason I'm not pressing charges is because my father didn't want that. You have 48 hours to leave. Linda stared at me, waiting for me to waver. But I'd spent 18 years building walls she couldn't breach. She left without another word. I later learned that the relatives who'd once supported her now refused her calls. She was alone. Julia returned a few days later to collect her things. She was a shadow of the confident sister I'd known. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something fragile. She moved through the house like a ghost, packing in silence. In the kitchen, she finally confronted me. This is your fault, she snapped, her voice trembling. If you'd just stayed away, none of this would have happened. Everything would have been fine. If I'd stayed away, I replied quietly, you'd have inherited everything based on a lie. You'd have spent your life not knowing who you really are. Who am I then? Julia exploded. My mother's a liar. My father isn't my father. I don't even know who my real father is. Everything I believed was a lie. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face. I spent my whole life thinking I was special, that I was the real daughter, and you were the outsider. Now I find out, I'm nobody. I don't even have a name that belongs to me. I let her rage. When she finally slumped against the counter, Exhausted, I spoke. I can't answer those questions for you. I can't fix what your mother broke. And I'm not going to pretend I've forgiven you for how you treated me. But I do know what it's like to feel like you don't belong. That part, Julia. I understand. She stared at me, eyes red. What happens to me now? Legally, you have 30 days to vacate. Beyond that, your life is your own to figure out. A few days later, I got calls from relatives who'd whispered about me at the funeral. Now they wanted to meet. To start fresh. I declined. You chose your side without knowing the facts. I'm not interested in relationships based on inheritance. Forgiveness isn't a participation trophy. It has to be earned. But not everyone had turned their back on me, and soon, I'd find a piece of my past I thought was lost forever. My grandmother, Evelyn, reached out and asked to meet at a small cafe. I hadn't seen her in years, but seeing her at the will reading had stirred something in me. She looked older, but her eyes were the same kind and full of memories. Your mother was my only child, she said, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. When she died, I tried to stay close to you, but Linda made it impossible. She told your father I was a bad influence. Gradually, I was pushed out. By the time you left, I'd lost contact with both of you. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a simple gold ring with a tiny diamond. This was your mother's wedding ring. She wanted you to have it when you were ready. I've been waiting 30 years to give it to you. I slipped the ring on my finger. It fit perfectly. For the first time since my mother's death, I felt connected to her. Later that week, I asked Mr. Patel if there was any way to give Julia a portion of the estate. He shook his head. Your father anticipated, you might ask. He left a note. I know your heart, Rachel. You'll want to share. But Julia has spent her life being handed things she didn't earn. The greatest gift I can give her is the chance to build something herself. Please honor my final wish. I accepted my father's decision. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. On her last day in the house, Julia paused at the door with her suitcase. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just said, I don't know if I can ever become someone worth knowing, but I'm going to try to find out who I am without the lies. I nodded, saying nothing, watching her walk away, not an enemy, not yet a friend, just a stranger with a shared wound. 6 months passed. I made decisions I never thought I would. The first was selling the family mansion. I couldn't live there. Too many ghosts. Too many memories of being unwanted. But my father had left me something else. A small cottage on the coast, registered under Mr. Patel's name for privacy. It was simple, peaceful, and far from everything that had hurt us. I made it my own, filling it with photos of my mother, my grandmother, and my father from happier times. One photo stopped me in my tracks, my father holding me as a baby, both of us smiling. I framed it and put it on my nightstand. I continued my work as CFO, but I no longer hid who I was. For years, I'd used my mother's maiden name professionally. Now, I claimed both. Rachel Evans Carter. Both names. Both parts of myself. The inheritance was more than I could ever spend. I knew what I wanted to do with it. I started the Mark Evans Foundation, supporting children from fractured families, giving them the support I never had. I finally understood. I was never the outsider. I was the survivor. And as I looked out at the ocean from my new home, I realized that sometimes, the family you build for yourself is the one that matters most.